Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today we plunder the examiner's report for 2017 to find the secrets of success at Romeo and Juliet. So let's crash straight in. So the examiners point out that students getting the top grades explored complicated ideas and emotions. Well, this is great news because Romeo and Juliet is absolutely full of emotion, so it should be possible to get really high grades. But how do we make those complicated? Well, let's have a look at four I have for you up here. So for example, we've got the risk-taking of the Friar. So the Friar agrees to marry Romeo to Juliet without parental permission. This is a terrific gamble. These are the two most powerful families in Verona, and if either of them object, he is likely to be imprisoned, perhaps even executed, and he'd certainly lose his role as a friar, so all his status is at risk here. So why does he do it? Well, he is a man of God, a man of peace, and mistakenly or not, depending on your view, he thinks the risk is worth taking because it's going to save lives and bring peace to the warring families. Now, we can look at the Friar and think that actually he fails in this task because when he marries Romeo to Juliet, it results in their deaths. And even worse than that, he abandons Juliet when she finds Romeo dead and just leaves her to fend for herself. So he could have prevented her suicide, but doesn't. And so we might simply just condemn him, and we might assume that Shakespeare wanted us to be exceptionally critical of him. However, the result is that the two families, the Montagues and the Capulets, do in fact reconcile. They stop their feud, they build this golden statue to the dead couple, and Verona lives in peace thereafter. So, although the Friar hasn't intended for Romeo and Juliet to die, the effect of that has been to save many, many lives and bring Verona to a state of peace. So there's an interesting possibility that the Friar is actually doing God's work, even though it leads to the death of the two lovers. So that's complicated, isn't it? Now, if we want to add a further level of complexity to that, we can look at the prologue, which talks about the star-crossed lovers. In other words, whatever the Friar did, they were going to end up star-crossed anyway. They were inevitably going to die. But the Friar has just given that death a greater purpose, a greater meaning, and something good has come from it. So we can, if we choose, side with the Friar and think he's just making the best out of an impossible deal. Right, let's try another feature of emotion, Juliet's great fear of hell. Now, I don't know whether you've picked up on this, but she could, as the nurse says to her, just marry Paris. You know, Romeo's exiled in Mantua. He can never come back. Marry Paris and, if you want to, have secret affairs with Romeo, perhaps. No one need discover the marriage. You can live as happily ever after as anyone else can in this culture where marriages are arranged. But Juliet can't do this, not just because she's 13, nearly 14, and not able to cope with the enormity of this adult decision. She also can't do it because she fears hell. She's married by the Friar in the eyes of God. And then to go and marry Paris is to condemn her soul to eternal damnation in hell. She actually believes in this, obviously. And indeed, many people in Shakespeare's time would have had exactly the same view. It was a 100% Christian society. There were no alternative religions. And you could actually be prosecuted for being an atheist. So you can see that Juliet has very good reasons for not marrying Paris, and if we take her religion further, risking her own death by not marrying him. Ultimately, however, when she commits suicide, she is also committing a mortal sin, and she would similarly go to hell for committing suicide. This is something that goes completely against the church's teachings. Life is a precious gift bestowed by God. And so at that moment, Juliet decides that, well, she might as well go to hell because, this is the implication, at least there she will be with Romeo. But that is a very complex rationale for why she can't marry Paris. It's not just that she's in love with Romeo and no one else will do. Right, now let's look at Capulet here. Now, most people see Capulet as a horrendous father, a terrible figure, and if they've watched the Baz Luhrmann film, they're convinced that that Capulet is a wife beater, and well, there is a very small amount of textual evidence. The only quotation that helps us there is when his wife turns around to him and says, "You are too hot," meaning you're too passionate. We could infer violence, but we do not have to. It is quite possible that Capulet is simply angry. He doesn't express his anger physically necessarily, but what if we can see what we as a modern day audience see as unreasonable behaviour? What if we can see that as the work of a good father? So Capulet believes he is doing what every good father must. He is finding the very best match for his daughter. And Paris is a much better match than Romeo, even if the two families were getting on. Paris comes from a far more wealthy and influential family, and therefore would be, in the standards of the time, an even better match than Romeo. So Capulet sees himself as doing his daughter not just a favour, he's actually providing the very best person any father at the time could actually give. Added to that, he thinks that this is going to bring her joy because she's grief-stricken, as far as he knows, at the death of Tybalt. So he's trying to give her emotional support by increasing her relevance to the family, her status, her role within the family suddenly becomes much more important. And as I say, he is doing his very utmost to please his daughter. To him, it's incomprehensible that she'd suddenly turn round hysterically and start rejecting the match. Makes no sense to him at all. And why should it? He doesn't know about the marriage to Romeo. And then again, by the standards of the time, he thinks he's being very kind to her, because although to us it's ridiculously young to get married aged 14, which is what she'd be when she gets married, or a week away from it, he's thinking, well, that's older than Lady Capulet when I married her. You know, I'm actually being quite generous here and giving you a longer childhood before you take on the responsibilities of being a woman. Okay, so hopefully that's given you some very complicated ideas about Capulet's emotions. And then finally, let's deal with the nurse, because she's betrayed Juliet's love. When she says to Juliet, you should marry Paris because Romeo's a dishclout compared to him, she is completely ignoring Juliet's fear of hell. You get the sense that the nurse isn't particularly religious, in the sense that it's a habit going to church. She's not really interested in the morality behind it. And so from her perspective, Juliet marrying Paris is just a practical move. And we can see that in royal families throughout history, and even in our own royal family now. You know, you get married, look at Prince Charles and Diana. The marriage exists on the surface, but then you go off and have affairs with the people that you are really in love with or are particularly attracted to. And this is kind of standard behaviour for rich families of the time. So the nurse is expecting Juliet simply to continue her love life, if you like, with her lover Romeo behind Paris's back. Or, even if she can't, it's a practical solution because Romeo's out of Verona and off the scene. But more than that, we get the strong sense that this is the moment where she stops sacrificing herself for Juliet. So originally, she was the go-between, helping Juliet to marry marry Romeo. She was taking a big risk here, like the Friar was, but now she's decided it's too great a risk and she'll protect her own interests. Okay, next, the examiners focus on the need to write about context, but they have a word of warning. Better students wrote effectively about where the extract appeared within the text. So when you get this extract question, it's really easy just to start quoting and getting in on a language level and start analysing the characters' intentions here. Well, you do have to do that, but you're missing a trick if you don't think, why does that extract appear in the play where it does? So I will explore that with you in a moment. But when you do that, you're not just exploring character development, okay? You're trying to say, why is it there in terms of structure? And that's the context of the play itself. That counts as context. Let's see what that might look like. So let's imagine Tybalt's challenge to Romeo, where he challenges him to a duel. Romeo says that he has more cause to love Tybalt than he can say. Tybalt is enraged, and Mercutio sees it as vile submission. Romeo simply displaying cowardice, not meeting Tybalt's challenge, and he steps in. But why does that happen where it does? Well, Shakespeare places it immediately after Romeo is married. So on one level, he's signalling to us that the marriage itself is the cause of the tragedy. And so the blame is very much with Romeo and Juliet for getting married in secret, and also with the friar and the nurse for facilitating it. That is the tragedy of the play. The other could be a comment on marriage itself. So here we might look at Shakespeare's own marriage to Anne Hathaway, and he might be saying that marriage itself leads to disaster. You know, the other marriage that's examined in the play is that between Capulet and Lady Capulet, and you can see that's not happy. There's much conflict between the two. Capulet seems pretty distant from his wife. He orders her around. There isn't much affection between them, and in fact the only conversations they ever have together are about Juliet. You know, they don't seem to have anything else in common. So it could be seen as a criticism of marriage itself, and that's why this death comes immediately after the marriage. Or we can take a different perspective. We could say that Shakespeare is promoting the new adult behaviour of Romeo. So once he is married, he suddenly stops behaving in this classically masculine way. The masculine behaviour in the play so far has all been about the feud. Tybalt, Benvolio, the Capulets, the Montagues, they've all been engaged in a running feud and battle. And Romeo rejects this battle at the moment that he's been married and refuses to fight. So we could see marriage as something to be celebrated, a sign of maturity, but that is ruined once Mercutio is killed by Tybalt. Romeo then loses his adult perspective, if you like, and reacts as a teenager, or if you prefer, as a male. So archetypal masculine behaviour where he resorts immediately to violence and revenge. Okay, well, perhaps your extract is the part where Romeo talks about my mind misgives, you know, and he has this vision before he goes to the Capulet party. It's just before Mercutio's Queen Mab speech. Well, why does Shakespeare put it there? Well, he has this vision of tragedy directly before he goes to the party because it's signalling to us that Romeo is the cause of the tragedy. Had he not broken society's rules by going to his enemy's party, the tragedy would never have unfolded. So we can blame Romeo entirely. Or we can look at the language he uses about that he that hath the steerage of my course being a reference to God, and we could see this as signalling that it's part of God's plan to kill Romeo and Juliet. And obviously there's the biblical precedent for this. God sacrifices his own son, Jesus, whose death then brings eternal salvation to mankind. So God, if you like, has form. He's got history of operating this way, sacrificing the innocent in order to preserve the greater good. I don't know if you've ever thought of Jesus' death that way, but it's definitely a sacrifice where God partly sacrifices himself. And so we can look at the innocent Juliet and the innocent Romeo, who have been totally outside this feud, and they are suddenly sacrificed by God to prevent the feud from proliferating and indeed to end it. So that's one possibility, isn't it? You might also look at the Queen Mab speech here, and if you go into detail on the Queen Mab speech, it is very misogynistic. That means anti-women, and Shakespeare might place that here to talk about the problem of this patriarchal society that treats women as disposable objects. So here, the tragedy is the way that Capulet sees his daughter, not as a human being, but actually as a woman who is simply an extension of himself. And he expects her to be grateful for the opportunity to become more powerful as a Capulet, as an extension of his own power, whereas, of course, she sees quite the opposite. She wants her own independence, to be married to Juliet, to be married to Romeo for love. Okay, another structural bit that's quite interesting is Romeo killing Paris outside Juliet's tomb. Now, I found this really fascinating because it's cut out of most films of the play. You probably even had it cut out when you read it in class. I've certainly taught this play before and left that out. And then I thought, oh, hang on, this is really important. Why does Shakespeare decide that Romeo should kill Paris? Well, we could argue that he puts that there to show that love is itself a violent emotion. He's quite suspicious of love. If you think about the Friar's words about stumbling before you and falling as Romeo is preparing to marry Juliet, he's warning against too much passion. He talks about loving moderately. So we can see the play as an attack on romantic love. And one way of showing that attack is by having Romeo kill Paris. Because Paris is, again, in love with Juliet. And ridiculously is prepared to die for this love, even though Juliet's already dead. I mean, that's utterly and completely irrational. But both lovers, Romeo and Paris, are prepared to kill the other just to keep Juliet's dead body to themselves. Bizarre, isn't it? Now, again, we can make the link to the patriarchy, and Shakespeare could be arguing here that this society that even fights over a woman's dead body ultimately just treats women as pieces of meat, as possessions, and this doesn't lead just to the terrible lives of the women concerned. It also leads to tragic consequences for the men, who are no longer able to think rationally and would rather die. So very interesting. And the other reason why this scene is often cut is it stops the love for Romeo and Juliet being a purely romantic thing. It's also highly destructive. Now, obviously, we want a feel-good story, don't we? Where we're on the side of the two lovers against their parents and the feud and their families. But Shakespeare's more subtle than that, and is actually suggesting that true love is not necessarily a good thing. True love is also linked to violence and irrational behaviour. Okay, the next thing that really impressed the examiners was when candidates wrote how themes evolve and how the characters develop over the course of the play. Now that is actually the easiest one to do. It's very easy for you to spot how characters change, and if you say why they change, you're really into exploring the higher grades. So here are 3 examples I want to give you. So why Romeo and Juliet don't develop, but their parents do. So Romeo and Juliet stay true to each other throughout the play. They don't grow in maturity in any way, although we could argue that Romeo briefly does when he refuses to fight Tybalt, but literally minutes later he's killing Tybalt because Tybalt has killed Mercutio. So there isn't really any change in Romeo's character, and nor is there in Juliet's. And another reason for that, of course, is that their story only lasts about 24 hours, well, maybe a bit more, but we're certainly not into 2 days, so they don't really have that much opportunity to develop. However, their parents take a totally different perspective on life once their children are dead. So we can infer from this that Shakespeare's purpose is to educate parents. And we can go 2 ways here. One, it could be to educate parents to pay more attention to the feelings of their children and allow them therefore to marry later and not to force arranged marriages when they're young. Or it could be a warning to parents not to let their children develop all these ideas of their own, not to allow them to fall in love with the people of their choice, because as the play shows, disaster follows if you allow children to follow their passions, and instead you've got to make sure that they follow the family line, family honour, and they think about the future and the influence of the family in society. So 2 opposite meanings, both of which you can argue. Secondly, we could look at the development of the friar. Now I've already covered that earlier in the video, and so seeing how the friar is defeated in the sense that Romeo and Juliet both die, but he's also victorious in that his sacrifice, which is also their sacrifice, leads to peace in Verona. And then I've also touched on how the nurse develops. So initially she shows her love to Juliet by taking massive risks with her, by being made unemployed if the family discover that she has secretly helped Juliet to marry Romeo. She's taking a huge risk, much more so than the friar, because at least the church would look after the friar. But this is the nurse's only employment. If she hasn't got that, then she's out on her ear and doesn't have a means of earning an income. But anyway, finally, she betrays Juliet. She decides that that risk was too great, and she takes the pragmatic decision of recommending that Juliet marry Paris in order to secure her own employment and future. And, Shakespeare might be making the point that working class people aren't allowed the luxury of following their honour or their desires or their passions, and therefore why should the rich, why should Romeo and Juliet feel that they could follow their own passions? Why aren't they like the rest of society? And after all, most of society is made up of people like the nurse rather than people like the Capulets and Montagues. So we could take that view, or Shakespeare could be very, very critical of the nurse. But actually, he'd be critical of both. He'd be critical of her taking this risk of marrying the couple in secret, and then also critical of her suggesting that Juliet should risk her soul going to hell by marrying bigamously. In other words, by marrying 2 people at once. Okay, this slide is about what the examiners probably get most irritated about. They complain about this every year, and it is a plague of subject terminology. So this is what they say. Subject terminology should be the language which allows a candidate to write clearly and fluently about the text. So you will mention it's a monologue if you're talking about it being a monologue and that's relevant at the time. if it doesn't matter that it's a monologue, you don't really have to mention it too much. So you don't get marks for spotting language features. That means you don't have to go finding similes and metaphors. You just write about the quotations you need. If the quotation happens to be a simile or metaphor, then mention it for sure. But you don't need those words in your essay. Okay? And a lot of the words that you need as language features are in another one of my videos. I'll put a link to it up here, I hope. The thing that you definitely don't need is to keep banging on about how something's a verb, or it's a noun, or it's an adverb or an adjective. This drives the examiners crazy. Well, why? Because it rarely led to particularly fruitful analysis of Shakespeare's language. What you need to do is say why those words are important to our understanding of the character or our understanding of Shakespeare's ideas. And therefore, it's your thoughtful ideas which count, not the subject terminology itself. Now, a further problem of writing about it being a verb or a noun or an adjective or an adverb is that doesn't actually help us understand your point anymore. And so it's not fluent. Yeah, it's not writing fluently. It's putting extra words in that don't help us understand your point any better. So the examiners hate that. So do I. And here's a final reason why they dislike it. So the situation is exacerbated. Steal that word, it means made worse. So the situation is exacerbated when those terms, nouns, verbs and so on, were used incorrectly, which happens very, very frequently. And this one is a big no-no, because no matter how good your answer is, if you do that, the examiner will just simply think you're a useless student of literature, because a good student wouldn't make those mistakes. Therefore, they will mark you down, even though it's not in the mark scheme to mark you down. It's human nature. When you offend somebody, they take offence, you know, and they will genuinely give you a lower mark. Right. Now we come to other forms of context, and these need to come out of the particular details in the play. They can't just be added into the essay. So you get no marks for telling us about Queen Elizabeth or Shakespeare's marriage or his sonnets or courtly love. You get no marks for any of that unless it's relevant to a particular detail that you're telling us about in the play. So, for example, Romeo and Juliet's love might be a criticism of youth and a reference to his own young marriage to Anne Hathaway. So, if I can link his marriage to Anne Hathaway when he was 18 to the tragic consequences of Romeo and Juliet's love, then I can get credit for my context, because it gives Shakespeare a personal reason for deciding that this young love should end in tragedy. And that only works if I decide that he obviously didn't enjoy his marriage to Anne Hathaway, and there are lots of ways that I could argue that. Or Romeo and Juliet's love might signify that the patriarchy's arranged marriage of children of the nobility is a social evil. In other words, the tragedy happens because Juliet needs to marry Paris. That's the arranged marriage part, which is a patriarchal view of marriage, which says it has to serve the interests of the men. Here it's Paris's interests and Capulet's interests. And that's what leads to the ultimate tragedy of the two lovers dying. So Shakespeare sets that up in order to argue that his own society is ruining the futures of its own children, and particularly of the women. And if women were given a more equal status in society rather than just treated as objects, tragedies like this would no longer occur. And he could even argue that potentially amongst the nobility, amongst the rich, every marriage is a potential tragedy because nobody has married for love. Right. Now the examiners want you to have interpretations in the plural. So my advice is consider more than one interpretation of the theme in the question. And hopefully, as you've gone through this video, you've heard me talk about more than one interpretation. So let's have a look at another one. what might this be as two interpretations? The tragedy of the play might be the idealized aggression of male behaviour. So we can look at the feud, Tybalt as the Prince of Cats, this person who fights as though he's fighting to music, celebrating swordplay, celebrating violence. And then we've got the whole theme of revenge, where the families celebrate violent solutions to problems. This is a male behaviour. So that might be the tragedy of the play that Shakespeare is trying to expose. Or you might decide, no, that's not the main theme. The main theme is actually that our lives are controlled by fate, and Romeo and Juliet are doomed to die. Even if there isn't a feud between the two families, there would be some other way for them to be killed, because that's what the prologue tells us, that they are star-crossed lovers, and that fate is unchangeable. Or we could argue that fate is changeable because it's not God deciding fate, it's actually the social conventions. So the family feud is all about social conventions. The idea of arranged marriage is all about social conventions. And Shakespeare could be arguing that actually it's the social conventions which lead to the tragedy. If Romeo and Juliet didn't have to worry about what their family thought, then actually this play would have had an exceptionally happy ending. Two lovers who find each other and live happily ever after. So he could be arguing that we can change our fate by changing social conventions. So there you go. Here is another possible interpretation. Shakespeare could be arguing that romantic love is a childish fantasy, and that's why it's just these teenagers, Romeo and Juliet, who experience this childish love. If you want to view it that way, you don't have to, of course. Or he could be arguing that there is no such thing as real love. That sort of love is, if you like, a form of madness and just a poetic conceit. By that, I mean a construction of poetry, of poets. True love isn't like that. It doesn't last. And it's something that's just celebrated, in Shakespeare's time in particular, in the form of sonnets. But it's an idealised form of love that actually in real life doesn't exist. And instead, love ought to be concerned with securing a future. So here we could argue that his marriage to Anne Hathaway is a sincere one. She's much older than him. She's 10 years older than him. And he's doing it to secure her future, and then goes off to London to secure his own. But he doesn't live permanently in London. Interestingly, Shakespeare rents in London. Stratford is still his home, so we could argue that actually he values his marriage and his family there. And marriage is about the success of your future family. It's not about moments of passion. And then finally, we've got the invention, if you like, of the individual. So really, before Shakespeare comes along, or certainly Shakespeare and his contemporaries, plays involved characters who were there just to exhibit good Christian behaviour or bad Christian behaviour. And every play therefore had a moral where the good won out and the bad were punished. And so characters were not really real people who we'd recognise. They were types of people. They were stereotypes. So that you'd get the morally good virgin who was up against the sexual predator who's a butcher or something, I don't know. But they wouldn't necessarily be like real people. But because theatre really takes off dramatically in Shakespeare's time, suddenly playwrights like Shakespeare are inventing real individuals with inner lives and complex thoughts. So we could argue that Shakespeare's interested in this conflict between what it means to be a human being as an individual and what it means to fit into society. So most people in Shakespeare's day didn't have freedom. Shakespeare earned himself some freedom in this very new industry of theatres. But most people would be apprenticed into a trade. Their apprenticeship would last for 7 years or so. If they lived in the countryside, they'd often be tied to particular areas and not be able to leave them. It was very difficult to become your own individual self. Similarly, it was difficult to marry for love. If you came from a family that had any kind of wealth, you would try and preserve that wealth by marrying off your children to other families of wealth. And so this play explores that conflict, and it's up to you to decide whether Shakespeare says, no, if we'd left things to the individuals, it would have been a better world, or actually, no, the individuals brought about their own catastrophe and tragedy because they didn't follow society's rules. And an easy person to look at for that is not actually Romeo and Juliet, it's the Friar. You know, if the Friar had followed Christian values of the church, he wouldn't have been able to marry Romeo and Juliet in secret, and therefore the tragedy could never have happened. If he'd played by society's rules, everything would have been fine. Similarly, Juliet had played by society's rules of marrying who her father told her, everything would have been fine. Well, the other way of looking at that is the great cost. So yes, you say everything would have been fine, but Juliet would have had to have sacrificed her individuality in order to marry who her father wanted. And we could look at the Friar and say, yes, that might be right. He would follow the church's rules, but actually, what would God want? Would God want children to marry who their fathers told them to, or would God want them to find a true match, a true partner to marry, somebody who they would love and cherish forever? Really interesting dilemmas. So hopefully you will have a really powerful understanding now of how coming up with more than one interpretation is going to get you in the top grade. And if this is the only video you've watched on Romeo and Juliet, I guarantee you will have taken away stuff that will help you get at least a grade 7 in any question that can possibly come up on any character, because more than one thing will be relevant from what I've showed you. So I'm really pleased with the video, even though it's taken me so long and I've got through a whole cup of coffee. And if you have got this far, I applaud you, and I celebrate your work ethic, because you have what it takes to succeed. Thank you very much, and if you're a new viewer, don't forget to subscribe. I look forward to getting you grade 9s on my channel in the future.